welcome back to Everyday Therapy, where every day we're talking about therapy. And, every day is a good opportunity to talk therapy stuff because, we always got to be working on stuff. I don't know about you, but every day I'm realizing there's something I need to work on, or I look at the previous day and think, oh, wow, I didn't realize I did this, or, my issues come up every day, and that's why I think this is so relevant, and welcome back. Yeah.
Welcome back, everybody. Do you ever have people in your, out in the world, in your life, ask you, oh, you're a therapist, so are you psychoanalyzing me?
Oh, my. Yes.
Do you get asked that?
Oh,
I do, too, and what I just realized when you were saying that is it's not so much that I'm psychoanalyzing people, it's that I'm noticing things, and oh, that's an example of this. We talked on previous podcasts, we're doing a series on John Gottman's work right now, bids for connection. Mm-hmm. So I've been noticing bids for connection out in, in my friendships, even in relationships. And so it's not that I'm psychoanalyzing personalities so much. It's more like, I'm like, oh, that was a bid for connection in my head. Right. So it's more me just geeking out at all times.
Well,
right?
Come on. I don't know if you're geeking out. I think you're trying to, but I get that.
It's a
and maybe it is like us. We're weird. But I think what you're trying to do is say, hey, I'm learning these really cool things.
Yes.
And I want to apply it.
Exactly.
And for therapists, we just do this all day long, every day.
Yep.
And so it kind of becomes second nature.
Yep.
But
yep.
I think you're just trying to be healthy.
That's true. That's very true. Or I'm noticing interactions and be like, oh, that's what that's called, right? It's more like things you notice or you intuitively pick up on and you're like, oh, there's a name for that. So we're going to talk about some more of that stuff today because I think a lot of the elements that we've been going over as far as John Gottman are things that make sense intuitively to do in relationships. But what I love is Gottman has put a name to it, and it's like, oh, okay, that makes total sense.
And I just
go ahead.
What we've talked about with Gottman is that he put a name to it only after a huge amount of research to come to that conclusion. Mm-hmm. So. It's not like he was just sort of haphazardly doing that. So,
right. Yeah. Right. And
this is great.
I know it's so I thought I could start off with a statistic because who doesn't love a good factoid, right? Yes. So according to the California Divorce Mediation Project, 80% of divorce is due to people becoming emotionally distant and drifting apart over time. So this was a longitudinal study, and that surprised me, that statistic, because I think I just always assumed it had to do with the conflict is too high or we just disagree on too many things. And we're going to get more into perpetual conflict today. Mm-hmm. But it's no, disagreeing on things is every relationship and every marriage. But this is think about how intentional you have to be to stay emotionally connected to your partner. Right?
Yeah. It's funny because what seems weird to me when I hear that 80% of divorces happen by people just kind of growing apart, it seems almost too simple.
I agree.
Too simple an explanation. And then the solution has to be simple, but I'm guessing the solution's not as simple as it might appear.
Right. So what I love we've talked about this sound relationship house that Gottman developed, which is a really nice way to organize all sorts of concepts that he believes contribute to a close, healthy, stable relationship, right? Mm-hmm. Whether it be a marriage or whether it be a partnership. And I think that the first part, we're kind of recapping that today, but what I didn't realize before is the first part of this house focuses on solely the friendship of the couple. So you've heard the saying you want to be good. Not only do you want to be, in love with your partner, but you want them to be like your best friend / like a close friend. Right. Right. And I think that's something that I sort of left out before, didn't really connect. So the three components of the friendship are those love maps, which we talked about before, which is really knowing each other's world, being able to say, what are the most significant things that have happened in your partner's life? Right. Right. For example, because I was like, well, what does that mean? Right. Yeah. Love maps, what, and it's stuff like, who is your partner's closest friend? Mm-hmm. Right. Who is your partner close within their family? Just knowing intimately, their life story.
What's their greatest fear? Exactly. What's their greatest, what motivates them and things like that.
Exactly. Yeah. Yep. So that's the love map. The next
friendship.
This is the friendship.
Okay.
So the love maps is a component of the couple's friendship. The fondness and admiration system is another component. And I think that is where, Gottman is kind of looking at how does the couple express, affection towards each other, right? Mm-hmm. How do they show that they're fond of each other? How do they, and sometimes I think that's where the love languages come in, like we've talked about.
Right.
Which is not Gottman. That's a different psychologist. But, there's words of affirmation and there's gifts and different things. So that's another component of the friendship. And then I think last time we focused a lot on turning towards or away, which is the third component of the friendship. Mm-hmm. So, and that's where Gottman is really studying, like, does this couple, how do they do bids for connection, right? I think was it last time we focused on bids for connection?
We tried to be, specific about what bids look like. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because that's kind of a vague term, like a bid to connect. Bid. Because... Yeah, it can be just, hey, how was your day?
Exactly.
And sounds almost kind of innocuous, but it's someone's trying to make an attempt to connect.
And it can be something as simple as like, my roommate recently had a birthday and I gave her a birthday card. And in the card I wrote, for your birthday present, I want to take you out for ice cream. Like that is a bid for connection, right? Mm-hmm. Like, because she has an opportunity to respond kind of by being like, oh, yes, I'd love to. That's like turning towards, right?
Right.
And turning away would be like ignoring that offer entirely. And maybe a middle ground would be kind of like, oh, I'm really busy, but like, let's get something on the calendar. You know what I mean?
Right.
But I wanted to demonstrate like, not only is it what action I took, and then she has options for turning towards or away. Right.
And so I can see where someone makes a bid, hey, how about we go grab ice cream? And someone makes the bid to connect and the other person says, no, I'm really full.
Exactly.
And so
can
then
feel dead in the water, right?
Right.
Like,
yeah. That person, it feels like they've moved away. The other person can feel rejected.
Yep.
And then to protect themselves, they begin to move away just a little bit. And if that pattern sort of perpetuates itself, you see how people are just moving slowly but inevitably further apart.
Exactly. Exactly. So that was a really brief summary or like an overview of a lot of what we've covered already. These are some of the floors of this house, right? Mm-hmm. But I wanted to just point out that these floors specifically have to do with the friendship. So I like that because in here, maybe some of you listening are like, oh, I never realized that was part of the friendship aspect. Maybe this is something I can focus on in my relationship.
Yeah.
Right? So from there, do you think we're ready to move on to the next part?
I think we can move out of the friend zone now. Let's been holding on to that one.
Yeah, exactly. I could see it in your eye. I was like, there's something going on over there.
So what comes after the friend zone then?
Okay.
What's after that?
So the friendship should be, I think the other piece is the friendship should be maintained throughout the lifetime of the relationship. Like the friendship isn't just the starting point of a relationship, but Gottman talks about how the friendship needs to be nurtured forever.
It's not the starting point, it's the staying point.
There you go.
Yes,
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Okay, so then the next part has to do with positive or negative perspective.
Yeah.
Now this is fascinating. So this is based partially on the study on the work of Bob Weiss. And then I think Gottman kind of took it and ran with it. But there are, if the first part that we just talked about, like if the first part with the friendship is not working, it's possible there's some negative perspective going on where, and I'm going to get into a really fancy term.
Yay.
Called negative sentiment override.
Oh, sure. NSO.
Yeah, you know.
Negative sentiment override.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And that is where the couple has gotten to a point where one or both partners is unable to interpret signals and communications in a positive way.
Yes.
Right? So that's making more sense, right? It's a fancy word for like our relationship is in a place where even when you do something sweet for me,
right,
I'm either neutral towards it, like can't really register it, and or I think you're actually doing it passive aggressively, right?
What's really behind this?
Exactly.
Maybe I just really wanted to give you something.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Like what's your angle?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So, and again, I can't stress enough just like how much Gottman has researched this. So he has all these assessments that he administers to couples. So he has one called Negative Sentiment Override that says, fill out this form thinking about your immediate past, so the last 2 to 4 weeks, or a recent discussion of an existing issue with your partner. And in the, it's stuff like, in the recent past in my relationship, generally, I felt innocent of blame for this problem. True or false? I felt unjustly accused. True or false? I felt personally attacked. True or false? So it's showing.
Super practical.
Right? And it makes it, instead of it being this overwhelming thing, it's let's break this down. This has a name, right?
Right.
And the other one that can go with negative sentiment override is a harsh setup. So
yes,
how do arguments or conflicts start? When we so the assessment says, when we discuss our issues, arguments often come out of nowhere. True or false? I seem to always get blamed for issues. True or false? Right? Our calm is suddenly shattered. So it's a quick start where it's whoa, all of a sudden we're fighting, right?
How did this happen?
Exactly.
I asked, how was your day? And suddenly we're into this.
And suddenly here we are. So it's interesting. So you can observe this, in your own relationship, but it's basically a shorthand for negative sentiment override is you have a chip on your shoulder about your partner, right?
Right. Yeah. I like that.
Where you're kind of oh, well, you wouldn't say that. Or kind of those type of remarks. And yeah. So any thoughts on that? Have you seen this in couples?
Oh my goodness. This is resonating so much because it's what's so hard for me. I think as a therapist is watching this happen with couples and I want to say, whoa, wait, hold on. I'm not seeing that.
Right.
I mean, he said, or she, all your partner said was this. How did you draw that conclusion? Where's that coming from? And
exactly.
that I see a lot. So this is really resonating and seems really, spot on.
Well, and it makes sense why it helps to have that third party. People talk about, well, why do we need a therapist? Why can't we just figure this out ourselves? And it's if you are the neutral third party with a fresh perspective, you can see. It's almost like that analogy of how the fish can't see the water that they're swimming in. Right. Right? It's I'm looking at this from the outside and I can see what's happening, but you're so used to it, right?
So true. And what's even harder than I think as a therapist is you say, hey, I didn't hear what your partner said. And I'm hearing you've drawn this really negative conclusion. Right. But then that person, when I say that, make that observation, there's sort of this confirmation bias too that's really strong. Yeah, well, Brett, you don't understand, and they're really pleading their case and trying to convince me how wrong I am. And I'm I'm not taking sides. I'm just trying to show you what I see. But then there's this defensiveness that kind of acts in response, trying to convince me. And then I can get into a power struggle, and I don't want to do that. I'm just trying to help them see their pattern.
Exactly. So then there's, on the flip side, positive sentiment override, which is fun to learn about too, because it's almost the opposite. And I've seen this in couples too. And it's so lovely to see. It's where people see an irritable statement from their partner, almost just information. Oh, I noticed that had a little edge to it, but I'm not going to take it personally, sort of, or sure. Oh gosh, I noticed you sounded a little frustrated. What's going on? Instead of, I can't believe you're bringing this up again. Right. So this is hard for me, right?
They're not personalizing it. They're just really kind of differentiated from it to be something's going on with you. Right.
It's almost like the interpretation system is working well. It's the signals coming over are not registering as attack, right?
That's really
from
interesting.
Their partner, right? I know, it's so interesting. The other thing that Gottman said, which I thought was funny, is when people are in positive sentiment override, they also tend to find their partner's humor really funny.
I love that.
Right? They laugh at their partner, and actually, he said they're physiologically calmed by their partner's humor.
Wow.
Isn't that interesting?
That is very
just to review for those of you, if you missed any other episodes, Gottman went so far as to measure heart rate and, pulse and right?
As people are interacting.
And then he could see when they would come down. So positive sentiment override, their partner's humor, they not only find it really funny, but they're physiologically calmed by it.
Right.
So it just goes to show how important humor can be in a relationship.
Right.
Right? Especially if it's not mean humor. Right?
Yeah. And I don't know, as I'm listening to this, it really confirms for me that when I think I've got a problem with somebody, whether it's my partner or anybody I'm working with or a family member, my problem is precisely that.
Yeah.
It's mine.
Yeah, right.
And it's not somebody else. And if I think it's somebody else, and I think I get just cause to say it's somebody else, it's really still about me.
Right.
And positive sentiment override is basically saying, when you're good with you, you're going to be good with the other. This is really fun. Yeah.
Right. Isn't this cool? So I think what's good about this is like, we're looking at the friendship, right? That was the first part of the sound relationship house. Then we're looking at, okay, if the friendship's not quite working, could it be because one or both partners are seeing the other in this negative light? Right, so they're interpreting or filtering things through this negative sentiment override.
Yeah.
Now, the next piece, the third part of it is we get into actual conflict. So we have the friendship. We have how does the couple see each other, and then the third piece is how do they manage conflict. Now, this was one of the biggest takeaways I had was it's not resolution of conflict. So people always say like, oh, we need to work on our conflict resolution. But Gottman hammers on this. He's like, that's 69% of conflict in relationships will never be resolved.
Well, and you're encouraged by this.
Yeah, because I think it's a classic example of we're putting an effort on a futile problem sometimes. Like figure out which things are solvable. And then put all your energy towards that. That's great. But that's only 31% of problems.
That's an excellent point because I would say the things that are out of my control, the more I try to control them, they end up controlling me.
Yes.
And so really what Gottman is saying and what you're illuminating is that there is a lot when it comes to conflict that's unresolvable and out of our control. So if we keep focusing on resolving this, we may be focusing on something that's out of our control that ends up controlling us and then it becomes the defining part of the relationship too. Is like we just don't resolve conflict. But that's not the issue.
It's not the issue.
What's the issue?
The issue is we can't. So the wisdom in here that I love is it's not about resolving all conflicts. It's about figuring out which conflicts are resolvable. So if you have 100 conflicts, 69 of them are going to be ongoing, perpetual, not resolvable. You can dialogue about them.
Right.
But 31 out of those 100 conflicts are going to be, we can find a solution. Let's do that. But doesn't that give you realistic expectations? To me, that's what was so hopeful about it. Because I think people get really down on themselves when they're like, well, we've been having the same fight for years. It's like, yeah, it's one of those.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Maybe it's not that you have conflict. Maybe it's not so much that you are bad at conflict. Maybe you haven't accepted that this is going to be ongoing. So,
right.
Like the radical acceptance.
And you're just never going to resolve it.
Right. Because what he explains is the ones that are perpetual have to do with long-standing personality, like preferences, right?
Okay.
When I was in grad school, my professor used to talk about he and his wife never could agree on how much soap to use to wash the dishes. Like they didn't have a dishwasher early in their marriage. And, he would pour tons of soap in the dish, thing. And she would just use a little bit. And like they would get in tussles about it. And it seems like a small example, but the reason he said it is because I think he was trying to illustrate they'll never agree on that.
You won't. Right. Can I give another example that I see often? Because opposites do attract. And so in a simple sense, there are stackers and then there are spreaders, right? And
I already love this because I know which one I am.
What are you? You're
you go and I'll tell you at the end.
So you have somebody who's like the way God originally designed people to be stackers, right? So they want everything in order.
Sure, they want like a pile.
Yes, and so they want like, if they see everything spread out, it's like, oh my God, we got to do something about this now. And so we stack Or like the house has to always be in order. Okay. And so everything needs to be picked up. Everything needs to be put away. Dishes need to be cleaned. And so I grew up in a paramilitary home. And
I forgot that.
Yeah. So that's how I grew up. And for me, with my ADHD, I operate better that way.
Sure.
And it's just like, oh, okay, I'm okay now.
Yeah.
And if it's not, I get really stressed. Now,
Sure.
there are other people who are just like totally chill about stuff like that.
Yep.
And they're not as obsessive as I am. And they're just, but they don't see that piece of garbage or even just that piece of paper that's on the floor.
Right. Or a piece of mail that you've left out for a week. Or
Right. Yes. And they're like, well, okay, what's the big deal? And I'm like, what's the big deal?
Yeah, exactly.
And so that becomes a point in relationships, serious, unresolved conflict, because people can go head to head rather than just accepting and saying, yeah, can't believe how wrong you are about this. And you'll just, just jokingly, just laugh about it.
There you go.
Like, okay. But accept it.
Yep.
Instead of saying you have to be this way. Because like this is saying, it's never going to be resolved.
Right. So to answer the question of which type I am, I was just kind of looking at the table here.
I just thought of something. Yes, go ahead.
So I have, for those of you who can't see, which is all of you, I have my purse out. It's open. There's stuff falling out of it. My keys are there. My phone is there. I've got my iPad. I've got a cup of coffee. And this is tame for me.
This is tame,
This
right?
is tame for me.
Yes.
So I'm a spreader.
Yes.
I will stack when I need to. I can.
Yes.
It's not my default.
So what was happening earlier today is I bought Krista a bacon, egg, and cheese biscuit sandwich.
It was so good.
Yes.
It was so good.
She was done with it, and then the bag and napkins were on the table still.
I was going to get to them.
And I was cool with that. And it wasn't like even a critical thing. I just took the bag. I was going to throw it away, and the napkins are there. And maybe she wants them. No, I'm just going to get rid of them. And I didn't want you to get the wrong idea. I said, don't worry.
I do this.
I do this at restaurants. Like for everybody at the table.
That, yeah.
I just stack everything.
Yeah.
And it's not a criticism against anybody else. It just, it feels right. And
exactly.
I just like that.
I almost wish it was still here for effect. Like the garbage and everything. Yeah. Well, and so this is a great example of, instead of worrying about, we're always arguing, I think couples fall into a tendency of arguing about, this type of thing.
Yeah.
Where it's like, the point isn't that you're going to somehow resolve this conflict. The point is that you're going to be able to dialogue about it. So you can so the point is handling how you do conflict.
Yeah.
So recognizing which is a perpetual conflict and which is a resolvable one. And then when we are going to address our perpetual conflict, how are we going to go about that, right? Yes. Are we going to, and that's where you can employ all sorts of strategies, like picking a time when you're not hungry, angry, lonely, tired, right?
Yes.
Starting gently and softly, we talked about a harsh start to arguments, right? So just shaping some of those behaviors.
So I always talk about with parents, notice how you tend to do most of your parenting in times of conflict. The kid comes home at 11 instead of 10:30, and then we do our parenting. Why do you always, end up late? Why couldn't you call? And, you need to be more responsible. And so we do all this parenting in time of conflict instead of letting it pass. And then you go out, you grab a Coke or something together, and you say, you know what? Can we talk about when you came home at 11?
Nice.
And so what you're saying is in a relationship, and what Gottman is saying is realize you don't have to address it in a time of high emotion, and that's all that distress tolerance stuff we just talked about with DBT on the previous podcast. Do this in a time of non-conflict when you're connecting already with each other. Is that fair?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So there's ways to be strategic about it. And I think we mentioned this in a previous episode, but for long-lasting, another research tidbit for us is for long-term, happy, lasting relationships, the approach to conflict is gentle. So that's a kind of takeaway, right? Where we're not starting up harshly, we're not, maybe using hurtful words, we're not using sarcasm or passive aggressiveness. And then the other one is there's a 5-to-1 ratio of positive to negative affect. So right? So for every one criticism, there's 5
affirmations.
Exactly.
Yes.
And that, and to me, that seems like a lot, but that's, I mean, like, I'm like, wow, 5 to 1? Like, that's pretty amazing. So
yeah, and you think about it, like our culture is just the opposite,
right?
Like, it's about 25 to 1 and negative to 1. And just look at social media and things.
Yeah, exactly.
And
that's
just
such a good point.
Reading the comments in social media too.
Yep.
It's so predominantly negative, and I'm listening to all this too, and it's fascinating because I always think about the workplace too, and I think like the friendship, and then the sentiments, the negative sentiment override, the positive sentiment override, and harsh versus gentle startups and things. And this is really relevant for pretty much anywhere there's relationships, which is pretty much everywhere and every day, you could say. And a good opportunity to do everyday therapy.
Okay, well, I guess I'll finish this little piece about conflict.
Can we come back sometime?
Yeah, of
another
course.
podcast and talk more about how do we move from negative sentiment override into positive sentiment override?
I think that's a great question.
Yeah.
I guess what I can say in brief, my suspicion, or I guess my instinct, is that I think Gottman would say it's likely that there are some unresolved, maybe not conflicts per se, but there's maybe some hurts. There's some old things that never got addressed that could be addressed, like maybe a past incident that happened or some grief or, so, and I think he also might say that if you've been doing things a certain way this long, of course you're going to be in this negative place, right?
Muscle memory.
It's muscle memory, because a lot of us, again, I'll go to my grave. We see how our parents did relationships, and it's not their fault, but it's like, it makes sense to us. It's familiar.
Right. That's the way to do it.
That's the way to do it. And so I think we just have to retrain ourselves, and I think that's a big part of it too. But we absolutely should come back and do that.
Because I could just hear people saying to themselves, listening to this, like, hey, this is great. How do I do that now? What do we do?
Yep.
So maybe we can do that in another podcast.
Exactly. To kind of wrap up the conflict piece. So the other kind of a couple of terms that Gottman uses too is gridlock. So like with perpetual conflict, there can be like this impasse where each partner is so entrenched in their positions, and there may be hurt. And it may, like, so this is again back to the negative sentiment override, right? Where it's like, I'm not seeing your way because you're not seeing my way because I'm not seeing your way, right? Just like a circle of I'm not giving in.
Right.
And then another really important thing to notice is flooding.
Ooh, yes.
Yeah. So so basically when you're having a conflict, the shutdown. Earlier this week, I was talking with a client who was describing an interaction and said, and so-and-so just shut down. Like, so-and-so was totally shutting down, right? And I think they were talking about their partner, actually. So, but who wasn't there. But it was like, but again, I was like, oh, flooding. You know what I mean?
So that's when, flooding is when somebody is shutting down
in the conflict. Within the conflict. And it's usually because they're getting overwhelmed. It could be the intensity of emotion that's coming their way. It could be the level of stress they're already under. I mean, there could be all sorts of factors to it.
Information, but it's just this deluge coming, no matter what it is, coming all at somebody. They can't absorb it.
They can't absorb it.
Shut down.
And I think sometimes it might have to do with shame. Like maybe someone goes into a shame response. There's another assessment for it.
Great. He's a research maniac.
Right? So the piece or the part of the assessment on flooding says, true or false statements. Our discussions get too heated. I have a hard time calming down. One of us is going to say something we will regret. I think to myself, why can't we talk more logically? And then my partner has a long list of unreasonable demands. So to me, I think it's like the system gets jammed, right? It's like, this is too much coming in. I can't process this all, right? So I think that's when couples tend to, then the other partner gets more upset because they're like, well, why aren't you talking to me about this? Like, you always shut down. You always, right? Or why can't you stay in the conversation with me, right?
Yeah, good
it's
one.
like, I might need a break, right? I might need to calm down.
Right.
So.
And then we interpret that. There's that movement piece. Oh,
Yep.
you're moving away from me. So, okay, great. I'm going to move away from you, which is kind of where we started talking about just noticing how we withdraw.
Exactly. So I guess there's a lot more that we could say about conflict. It's a rich topic. But I think that the goal is just for like takeaways to regulate conflict instead of resolve conflict.
Right.
So manage it instead of resolve it.
I like that. Can you say that again? That's really good.
Regulate conflict instead of resolve conflict.
Yes.
And find compromise for those perpetual conflicts. So figure out ways to have dialogue without flooding, without gridlock, right? Figure out ways to have dialogue about your longstanding conflicts or longstanding arguments, basically. And then the point is to get better at communicating about them versus resolving them. So
good stuff.
Really good stuff. I mean, I think we've basically covered, because we talked about the walls of trust and commitment already.
Mm-hmm.
And then honoring one another's dreams and creating meaning together. Those are the last two parts of the house. I mean, I think between the 3 episodes we've done, I think we built the house.
I think so.
Don't you?
And it's rocking. But I also can see where people are listening to this and they might feel a bit flooded and want to shut down because, wow, there's a lot of information. What do I do? Where do I begin? And try not to be critical of that and just normalize that. Yeah, this is a lot. And it's come from massive amounts of research. And if you're overwhelmed, really the goal is not for you to listen to our podcast and say, oh, great, I got this. But hopefully to be able to say and conclude, you know what? This makes sense. This is doable. I got some hope if I can figure this stuff out, and it'd be the catalyst for you to go and get some therapy, go see somebody, talk it out, talk it through, and be able to apply all of these skills.
Exactly. You reminded me about an app, Gottman card decks.
Yes.
Which go through a lot of the things we talked about. There's a section on love maps. There's open-ended questions. I mean, so without having to understand all the theory and all the research, like there's some pretty practical tools you can use. Gottman also has a lot of content online. Like there's the Gottman Institute. There's just a ton of articles out there. So it's Gottman. So just kind of Google it up.
I love it. And what I use the card decks. My wife and I, early in our marriage, we would say if we went on a date, went out to dinner, can't talk about kids, can't talk about work.
I love that.
Yeah. And because that tends to be all we talk about.
Yeah.
And so we're really not getting to know each other. We're not building that friendship. And I enjoy the card decks because they have date questions as another deck of cards.
Yep.
And you really get to know your partner on a different level and talk about things maybe you used to talk about before you were even married.
Right, exactly.
So it's super practical. I just wanted to endorse that. I really enjoy it. All
right. Well, I thought today was real interesting. I hope you all did too.
super, super relevant. Hopefully we've given you the nudge to realize that, hey, therapy, this is an approachable topic and I can go get some help for it. So we're glad you were able to listen and look forward to you joining in next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you as always for listening, and please be sure to leave us a review. While this podcast can't be a replacement for therapy, we hope you enjoyed our discussion today and join us again next time. Nystrom Associates is always available to those who are struggling. If you find yourself in need of support and help, please check us out at nystromcounseling.com.